I'd say I enjoyed about 40% of Cold Case Files, which is unusual and unfortunate because I love true crime series that look at unsolved cases and then, try and solve them and work out how years later, due to the developments in forensic technology, these cases were able to be solved. And that's kind of what this does. But there are a few reasons why it wasn't as good as I'd hoped. I will say on the positive side, I hadn't heard of any of these cases. As a seasoned true crime addict, it gets quite difficult to watch a true crime series where I've not heard of any of the cases. But actually, with these, I don't believe I'd seen or heard any of them. This is just the first season, by the way. This was released in 2017. That's all that's on Amazon Prime for me at the moment. Will I watch the second season if it comes out here? Yes, I will. I enjoyed it enough, but it wasn't what I had hoped for, apart from a few episodes. So each episode details the original case and what happened. Some of these were 30, 40 years ago, and we get to see a lot of kind of pictures of the victim at the time, and you can really feel the passing of time because, if there's video footage of changes in fashion and style, you get a good sense of how much time has passed and how long it takes them for the case to be solved. Because these are cold case files, it needs to be remembered that they haven't been working on these cases for 30 years solid. The case gets shoved in a filing cabinet, and then at some point there will be a cold case unit and they will put new developments in technology to these cases to see if anything can be done. And there were two reasons why I didn't like this as much as I could. The first is to do with the editing of the episodes, and the second is to do with just the way it's presented. The editing refers for me here to the pacing, the tone, and the atmosphere. I can't quite work out why with regards to the atmosphere, but it didn't feel intense. With true crime series, you're often on the edge of your feet. It's quite dramatic. They reveal things at the last minute to keep you going. And it just didn't really have any of that. There was no eeriness. The music wasn't very creepy. And sometimes, that's fine if it's got other aspects. But I felt like it just wasn't withholding information. It just kind of divulged everything pretty much immediately, apart from revealing who the killers were. I will give it that. It doesn't tell me, who the killer was. But we find out a lot of information really quickly, and I wish they'd kept a little bit more back. That's not for every episode, and maybe that's why I liked some more than others. But I feel like the editing as well, the way it goes back and forth between interviews and recreations of clips. I will say the recons were pretty okay. They didn't feel too cheesy. You get a lot of true crime series where they're recreating scenes and they are just, they've had too much fun doing it and it's really too creative to be realistic. But actually, they're alright here. So the actual style of presenting the stories I think could have been better. It could have been more engaging, and it could have been more intense. Because basically it felt like I was watching a documentary about, I don't know, wildlife. It had that kind of just, this is a package where we're going to have some interviews, some archive footage, some recreations. There's no real drama to it, I guess. But the actual stories themselves are pretty interesting. The first episode is about a young girl who was kidnapped at Halloween, and then we go on to an elderly couple who were murdered. And straight away, having kind of those two contrasting introductory episodes shows us that there's going to be variety in this, and I will praise this completely where it deserves this, because I did enjoy some of it. There is severe variety. It's not one of those ones where every victim is the same age, and every victim, it was a familial crime, or it was a stranger murder. You can kind of watch every episode and not be able to work out who it was based on the other episodes. It's very individual, and in that way, I guess it is a little suspenseful, because while I love documentary series that are all about, say, for example, familial crime, you can work out who the killer was pretty quickly. Not so much the case here, and I do have to applaud it for that. So I won't go through every single episode, but I'll talk about a couple without giving spoilers. And the first one that I loved was The Night Shift, and this is about the murder of Brad Perry. This worked really well for several reasons. I thought the the reconstructions worked really well. They felt believable. They felt like they were at the time as well. I believe this was in the 80s or the 90s. I can't remember exactly. It might have been even earlier than that. I'm kind of trying to revision what the mustaches were like at the time. It might have been the late 70s. It's not important at the moment. But basically, he was murdered on a night shift, and this one was gripping because I thought the murderer was X, and then I thought it was Y, and then I was back to X, and then I went to Z. Really didn't know what was happening. This looks at particularly blood as evidence of DNA, and a couple of other things as well. Some circumstantial evidence that became a little bit more apparent. That one I thoroughly enjoyed. I felt like Brad Perry was very likable. What was interesting is that he was actually engaged to be married at the time, and there was no mention of his fiance's whereabouts during this. Not that she was a suspect, but like there's a lot of questions that are not answered, and partly that's because each episode's only like just shy of an hour. But you know, it was talking about how he was happily engaged and looking forward to his future, but then that aspect of his life was never actually mentioned or kind of used, saying, is there any connection to the murder? So it doesn't cover all grounds, but time constraints, that's completely understandable. The other episode that I truly loved, and I think the only other one that I adored, no, that's a lie, there are two other ones that I liked. The other one is called Officer Down, which involves the murder of Lieutenant Joe Clark. And this one I thought was very cleverly done. We get a lot of information about guns and different barrels. I learned a lot. Very educational, but also one of the most emotional as well. Because you just don't kill a police officer. You just don't do it. And I found that very moving. And we get to hear from his children, his son-in-law, other individuals who have gone on to have their own children, and he would have been their grandfather. And it's not just about it really highlights that murder obviously was very impactful at the time, but also people who weren't even alive then are being affected by it because they're missing out having the grandfather and all these wonderful experiences. The outcome surprised me a lot. It was not what I'd expected, and it annoyed me, but it was triumphant to seeing this being solved. And the last one that I want to mention in any kind of detail is about the disappearance of Shannon Sider. And this case, this was really interesting for quite a few reasons, but I think the main reason that this one moved me is because of her father. Genuinely welling up just thinking about him. He seemed like a genuinely good guy who truly cared about his daughter. Of course he did. I'm not saying the other parents didn't, but there was just something about him that made me think his entire world had come crashing down because of what had happened to his daughter, and it was hard to watch. He was hard to watch, but it's worth it because it's an emotional journey, but you get that sense of at least a modicum of justice, which I think is the end game with all of these. I really enjoyed the bits that I enjoyed. I really truly loved. So the episodes I've mentioned, if you're looking for any specific to watch, I would say those ones in particular. It's moving, it's touching. The other episodes are okay. I wouldn't say don't watch them. But I'd say prioritize the other ones first. The other thing that's particularly unusual about it is that the suspects have already been, like whoever did it, they've already been imprisoned, etc. Whereas similar documentaries will actually take you on the process of trying to track them down and identify who it is. This one is saying how they did it. So there's also not that aspect of anticipation, wondering, will they find that person? Will there be any DNA evidence? You kind of already know that there is, because that's the setup. But it's interesting. It's good enough. Cold Case Files is not perfect. Some of the episodes are not as interesting as others, and I don't think it's quite as dramatic as it could be. But if you're a true crime fan, certainly season 1, I think it's worth watching.